McClellan, where are you? Oh, sorry, you're going to start. Okay.
Yep, we're starting. All
Yeah.
right, we are now live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Google Hangout event. My name is Ellen Wright. I'm at Orbit Books. I'm very excited to introduce to you our two panelists today. We have Brandon Sanderson, who many of you probably know, one of the most popular writers of epic fantasy out there. He is currently working on, or most recently, his book was Words of Radiance, the sequel to The Way of Kings, earlier this year. I also have Brian McClellan, who is an Orbit author whose debut, Promise of Blood, we published last year, and book 2, The Crimson Campaign, comes out next week. The other thing that joins these two authors together, besides the fact that they are both excellent epic fantasy writers, is that Brian actually took writing classes from Brandon back in the day. So they have known each other for a long time, since Brian's career began, pretty much. I do want to jump right into the discussion, but first let me say we will be taking audience questions during this event. There are two ways you can ask them. We're using the question and answer feature on Google, so if you're watching us from Google Hangouts, you can go ahead and type in your questions on the right side of your screen. We'll be able to see those. We will also take questions on Twitter. You can just ask them at the Orbit Books Twitter account, and we will also be using, if you would like to join us, the Orbit SFF Hangout Twitter hashtag, which we've used at previous events like this. So having said that, again, welcome everyone. Thank you, Brandon and Brian, for being here. I'm going to start by asking about the things that I've already mentioned. Brandon, you teach creative writing. Brian, you took Brandon's class. So let's start with Brian. What was it like taking a class from Brandon? What did you learn? Were you absolutely bushwhacked to be in his class at the beginning?
You're in trouble now.
No, it was actually a ton of fun. I started. I want to say it was either right before or after Elantris came out. Was my first semester, and I remember that being it was my first writing class ever, and I was absolutely delighted to find that it was science fiction and fantasy focused, because that's what I wanted to do.
Really, you signed up for it without knowing?
Well, I found out pretty quick, so I was just going in for creative writing classes at the time, and hoping they had something, and it was a very cool to be in there. You co-taught the first year I was there.
Okay, so it was my second year. Yeah, there was this weird thing. So they'd had this science fiction fantasy writing class for a while. Another professor was teaching it. Then he retired, and Dave Wolverton took over. Writes under the pen name Dave Farland, and I took it from him. This same class, and he taught it for like 3 years, and then he went off to Hollywood and was trying to get a movie made, and so then they had like a sequence of guest teachers, and they were worried it was going to get canceled, and so Sally, who was a professor on staff who was planning to retire, who had, I think, taught it 1 year, or maybe she hadn't, she was really interested in sci-fi fantasy, came and said, hey, you have a book deal, maybe you should teach this thing. And I was in the master's program at the time, so I went and I took it over the first year and taught it, and that was the year that Jancy was in it. Jancy, she publishes under Jancy Patterson, I believe, and she was the first of my students to get published, and so that was pretty cool. It was years later that she did, but I took it that first year, and then the second year they're like, who is this guy? We're not sure if we should be having him teach. He only just got his master's degree, and I'm like, you just gave me the class for an entire year. And so then they're like, well, and so they had Sally come teach it with me for a year to make it more legitimate for me teaching this class, which was hilarious.
And I don't know if it's just me with a skewed perspective looking back, but I remember you being like 75-80% of the class, the teaching. Yeah,
it was mostly me, because Sally just came in for legitimacy. She had told me I had taught the class an entire year on my own, and she's like, yeah, they're worried, the administration, whatever, let's team teach it for a year, which is basically she sat in on the classes and gave me some pointers on teaching. And she did teach some of the class. Mostly it was me teaching with her looking over my shoulder, which was actually really helpful. She's a great teacher, but it was funny that they did it that way. It actually turned out pretty nice, because that was the year that my girlfriend at the time decided to take the class from me. Did you ever know Heather?
I don't think I did.
Yeah, Heather decided to take the class, and I'm dating this girl. She's like, "Oh, I'm going to take your class." I'm like, you can't do that. That's not how this works. Idea. And then she just signed up for it. But fortunately, Sally was team teaching, so I gave everything to Sally from my girlfriend. But it was pretty. I show up on the first day. She's like, "Surprise! I signed up anyway." I'm like, "Heather, you can't do this." But that was the year that Isaac took the class for the first time.
Yeah, I believe that's when I met Isaac for the first time.
Yeah, that's when I met Isaac for the first time. Who, those watching, he's now my assistant. He's sitting on the floor behind me, making sure I don't do anything stupid.
He's also the one who did the maps for my books.
Yes, he did the maps for your books and most of my books. He is a brilliant artist and cartographer, a great guy, and he took that class that same year. And then you took it like another year, or
I think it was a repeatable elective, so
yeah, it was.
I just wanted the credit, and I knew I already liked the class, and it was a format that would help me be a better writer. So I think I took it 2, maybe even 3 times officially.
Yeah. I remember those early years. You were there quite a bit.
Yeah.
Which year did you write that really awesome story that I loved so much?
That was the second year.
Second year.
That was that was when you were off on your own.
Well, when are you going to publish that thing?
I pulled it out last year when you were telling me that I should look at it again, and it's really way more awful than I remember it.
Aren't they always?
Yeah, I think so. There's a short story, a short novel that I wrote from that story.
Okay.
That I may someday.
That's what I kind of mean. Not publish it as is, but that idea was really cool. So.
Yeah. No, that class. I think the thing I loved the most about it was that it was the first experience and one of the only I've had where a writing teacher, was looking at it from the perspective of writing as a business.
Right.
And that was a huge kind of eye opener for me, and I think really helped me, kind of sit in a good track for the next, several years until I did get a deal.
Yeah, that's what when I took the class from Dave, that was the big thing that meant a lot to me. When we look at the history of this class and the number of writers that have come out of it, and I think it boils down to the fact that we have it's a science fiction fantasy class, yes, but it's also a business-oriented class. And you don't get a lot of those at university because a lot of the professors don't quite know the business. They know the writing, they don't know how to actually, make money off of it. So, yeah. We're supposed to be taking questions and stuff, aren't we? We're just blabbing.
Yeah.
That's all right. It's really interesting, actually, to hear you guys talk about people you knew and people you worked with. But I'll go ahead and give you one of the audience questions, since we've already got a bunch coming in, and those are probably more interesting than the questions I came up with. So here's the first one. This is from Luke Johnson on Google, and he asks, I'll put a little editorializing in here. You both write very complicated books, lots of characters, lots of plots. How do you outline your books? Let's start with you, Brandon.
I outline backward. I start with what I want to have happen in the story. My climaxes and my great moments of power and emotion, and then I ask myself, what foundation do I need to lay to make this ending successful? And I build my outline based off of those awesome scenes that I want to occur. And then I write my book forward. I have to write chronologically.
Brian, what about you?
I actually didn't realize that I write very similarly. I like to kind of think, I've got usually an idea of where it's going to end up and a few of the things that I want for sure to happen in the book. And then I kind of go along, and if I think of other cool things, it gradually fills in. But I also have to write chronologically. I very rarely skip ahead with scenes, and if I do, it's because I'm having a hard time with what I'm currently working on. But very similarly.
So Brian, you're what we call a points on the map writer. This is where you have 4 or 5 powerful scenes you want to get to, and you basically discover yourself from one to the next.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very common sort of hybrid discovery writer outliner methodology. It's what Robert Jordan used for writing his books, and it works a lot, very well, because you seem like just reading your writing and seeing what you were doing, you feel like you're mostly a discovery writer. But a big problem that discovery writers have is not having really powerful endings. And so if you can think up 3 or 4 really awesome scenes to write toward, then you can kind of hedge. You can do mostly discovery writing while you can use these powerful scenes to bolster that idea of having a powerful ending and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of big events in your books, I noticed, I'm sure this is, it's not the biggest part of either of the books, but in both The Way of Kings and Promise of Blood, there is a king who is murdered very early on in the books. What do you think draws epic fantasy writers and readers toward monarchies and kings and overthrowing the government, that kind of thing?
Well, that's a large question.
Yes, it is.
I would say the monarchies and kings thing. Number one, with fantasy, we do have this sort of idea that we're looking toward an idealized, in some ways, monarchy, because number one, it's fantasy, right? We're doing swords. We're doing, we want to have more of an antiquated feel. Not necessarily. I mean, a lot of the fantasy. I mean, Brian's obviously writing in a much more advanced technological state than a lot. But I think medieval fantasy is very uncommon these days. It still does happen. A lot of where I'm writing in a Renaissance era and things like this, technological development. But the idea, the king idea, we like, I think, because one person can really make a big difference. And when you're writing from that person's viewpoint, it's interesting to have this person who have such an influence, so it makes so many changes. It's sort of this individualistic thing. It might be kind of an American thing, this idea of the individual, which is really weird that the American thing would be writing about the king. But if you really look at it, this idea of one person changing the world is a big theme that we find in a lot of fantasy. I think that might be part of it. Part of it is you're looking at the people where the conflict is happening. And in epic fantasy, we're looking at large-scale conflict. That's kind of one of the definitions of what makes it epic. And so if you're going to deal with large-scale conflict, you're going to put people in the middle of those conflicts and people who can influence those conflicts, and they tend to be people in positions of power.
I like that idea that it's sort of ironic that kings and monarchies are a very American type of fantasy. And obviously both of you are American writers of fantasy. Have you observed any differences between sort of the American epic fantasy subgenre and writers of epic fantasy from other countries?
Boy, Brian, I've been talking a lot. Why don't you weigh in on this? I'm going to think about that one for a minute.
Yeah, you know what? I don't think I even have considered that. I read mostly American epic fantasy. I read some from the UK, but honestly, I'm not even close to qualified to answering that.
What I've noticed in worldwide epic fantasy is worldwide epic fantasy does tend to be a little bit more in the Tolkien-esque realm. We're still dealing with, it seems like fantasy caught on a little bit later in some of the countries. I'm looking at writers from Eastern Europe and some of the stories I've looked at from Russia and things like this. And fantasy caught on a little bit later, and because of that, they're still exploring a lot of this idea of The Witcher is a great example of this. With the original, I can't remember what it's actually called in book form, but it does still have the elves and things like this. Of course, they're taking really interesting directions because of their cultural experience. But it is kind of interesting. Looking at the UK, a lot of the epic fantasy I've read from the UK is actually really veering toward the more personal. It's more when we talk about the more gritty personal fantasy, if you look at a lot of the writers there, a lot of them are doing that. If we're looking at Joe Abercrombie, if we're looking at Eliza Lockwood, they tend to be the more personal stories rather than the big epic sweeping stories. And I'm not sure what that reasoning is or why that is. It might just be coincidence. But I've often thought how ironic it is that the American writers really have seized on this idea of the king who can change the world, and things like that, and how reversed that is from our original cultural experience. There are actually essays written about this if you look online. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, and, maybe the UK writers are sick of the whole monarchy thing. So
yeah,
it's nothing new to them. Where to us, it's
a little bit harder for them to romanticize a monarchy, maybe.
Yeah.
We'll have to ask Abercrombie about that. See what he says.
We should have him in here next time. Joe. So we have some other reader questions or audience questions, so let me ask one of these. This question is directed at Brian, but I think either of you could answer it. How many novels did you write before you saw a steady growth in storytelling and writing skill, and probably how many did you write before you felt that you were ready to be published?
Honestly, I have Promise of Blood is only my third novel. I wrote one large epic fantasy, and then one kind of, I think it was 70 to 90,000 words, something like that, which is based off of that story that Brandon was referencing earlier. And then Promise of Blood came after that. There was a lot of half novels in there, a lot of things that I wrote 70, 80,000 words, and it just wasn't working, so I scrapped it. But I like sitting in a world until I feel like I got it right, as opposed to moving on. And that's purely personal choice. Probably for most people, it's better to put something in the can and then try to work on something new using what they'd learned. So it wasn't a ton, but that doesn't mean that, like I'm some crazy maverick or anything. It just means that I liked rewriting a lot.
Brian, do you where do you put your story? Do you say epic fantasy? If you're going to have to pigeonhole it into one, would you say epic, or would you put it more on the heroic side instead of the epic side?
I usually call it epic flintlock fantasy.
Okay, so you put it in the epic fantasy.
Yeah.
That's I would too, honestly. Reading it feels like that. It's just one thing I've noticed that's really interesting is a lot of my friends who've broken into writing, their very first book that they tried was a big, long, traditional epic fantasy. And, Dan Wells, who writes horror, right? Really tight, short horror novels. The first book he wrote was a big epic fantasy with elves and dwarves and things. And Jancy, her first thing that she wrote, and she went on, she writes contemporary YA, right? Her first thing she wrote, big, epic fantasy with all the tropes. Of course, my first thing was epic fantasy, and I ended up in epic fantasy. But it seems interesting that our generation, a lot of people who started with the big standard epic fantasy and then slowly found their way into what they really what their take on things was, and they changed dramatically after that first book.
Mm-hmm. No, even for me, I wrote, I did the same thing. I started off writing these enormous epic fantasy, drafts at least, and they had everything in them: elves, dwarves, dragons, whatever. And then I wound up writing in epic fantasy, but with a twist, an advance up to the 1800s technologically. Right. And my epic fantasies are a lot shorter than some people's, like yours or Brent Weeks. Mine only weigh in around 165, 170,000 words.
Only twice as long as a normal novel.
Yeah, but how long was your last one, Brandon?
No comment.
Here we have a great question from Twitter. This is from AAF Scott, who asks, if you're writing and you skip a hard section of writing, how do you come back and attack it later?
Oh gosh, I personally I just kind of play a lot of video games until I'm sick of myself and then go write. I guess it's my equivalent of getting really drunk.
I don't skip the hard scenes. I write them poorly and put them in with a note that this needs a significant revision later on. And that idea of writing, if the hard scene meaning you're just not ready for it yet, or you're not sure what's going on. That's one of two things usually for me. One is that I just don't have the foundation for that scene yet. I'm uncertain where I'm going, and there's just some sort of problem in the back of my head. And when that happens, it's best for me to write the scene out so I can look at it and say, wow, this was bad. This didn't work. Why? If I don't have it written poorly, I can't do that. I can't fix it. And the other problem is I'm just, not feeling right that day. Something's off. It happens. And when I write it, suddenly it'll be good anyway. I'll be like, oh, that wasn't the scene. That was me just having an off day. And once I write my way into it, then the scene actually turns out just fine.
No,
Brian, what video games you playing?
Oh gosh, my standard is Civilization 5.
Hmm. Civ
And
5 is awesome. I've
it's
spent way too much time on that. Do you
uh,
mod it at all, or do you play it vanilla?
I've been playing about the last 60, 70 hours on my Steam account has been modded games because I've been trying to play around with trying new things. But I'd been putting off getting a new laptop for forever because I'm like, oh, I don't need to do that. And then they announced Civ 6, and I was like, well, I should probably have a new laptop.
Civ 6, you mean the not Civ 6, the space one?
Well, I mean, I think it's Civilization Beyond Earth, but
Yeah, that looks fun.
yeah.
What little I know of it, those games are way cool. I spend way too much time on them. I remember playing Civ 1
Oh,
back in the day. I didn't have a computer at the time, at least they could do it. My computer, this was my freshman year at college, my computer that I had would do, it could barely do WordPerfect. It was one of those that there was no Windows, none of this stuff. Now, it was an old computer even for then, because we had Windows and things. I'm not that old. But this was all I could afford, so it was like, the $500 special, or maybe like the $200 special, something like that. And I wrote stories on it and things like that, but I couldn't play video games. But my friend across the hall had a real computer with Civilization, and I spent so much time like in his room playing on his computer. He was pretty sick of me.
Yeah.
I have a good question this time again from Google+. This is Lauren Butler asked this question. It's a good one for epic fantasy writers. How do you make something that you made up, whether it's an object or an organization, feel normal and familiar to the reader if you want them to be familiar with it?
I try to tackle it like I would tackle something that they would be familiar with. As little exposition as possible. And make it familiar to the characters while trying to get across what it is and what you're talking about. Make it regular to the world, and even if it's jarring at the beginning, a reader's going to pick up on that real quick.
Yeah, this is really the when I talk in my class about this, I call it the grand skill of epic fantasy writing, of speculative fiction writing. The ability to bring someone up to speed on the world in a way that is engaging, not full of info dumps, and feels natural. And as a writer, this takes a lot of practice. Brian made it sound easy because he's good at it, but it is the thing that's going to take you the most practice, I think, specifically for epic fantasy. Granted, you need to be able to tell a great plot and have great characters. That's very important. But the skill individual to writing speculative fiction is this thing, and you're going to have to ask yourself, how can I, specific to my personal genre, divvy out these things in a slow way that my reader can digest. For instance, if you're writing, punch to the face epic fantasy, you can just start throwing them at everybody in the first chapter. But if you're writing a middle grade story, you're going to want to pull something like Harry Potter, where you introduce these elements step by step, slowly, and you make them relatable to things in our world, so that the learning curve on it is more shallow. And it really just depends on what you're trying to do, your feeling of immersion. On different books of mine, I've used different styles of this. In Mistborn, I kept the learning curve much lower. I made the names that are surrounding what everybody's doing, I made the names much easier to swallow. They were not as fantastical of names. So that when I introduced the elements of the world, that you as a reader could focus on these things and spend a little more of your brain energy on saying, oh, this is the thing. Whereas when you go to something like The Way of Kings or Elantris, which is epic fantasy and secondary world, and very blunt about how secondary world it is, the names are a little more fantastical. And that's kind of you're going to have to swallow a much larger pill to get into this book, and that's just how it is. I want to prepare you for the fact that this world is really bizarre. Whereas the Mistborn world is a lot more similar to our world. And I do these just for different books depending on what feel I want for the book and things like this. So how you use your character viewpoint is going to influence this a lot. How they view the world and how they see things and how they interact with them.
That's huge, and I think the simplest technique, I think, is having either a viewpoint character or the viewpoint character's sidekick be somebody that's not familiar with the magic system or the government or something.
Yeah, you introduce a Watson,
Yeah.
a Watson character who can be like, wait, what? And say, oh yeah, of course, everybody wears these hats that make them fly. Didn't you know this? Whatever it is.
Here's another question that's unique to fantasy as a genre. Gunter writing on Twitter asks, how do you determine whether or not you should allow a problem to be solved with magic?
Well, I have an entire essay on this, but I don't know. I feel that, number one, it depends on where in your story it is. Solving your problems without foreshadowing in the first part of the story is generally what you do to introduce the magic, and that's okay. Solving your problems with unforeshadowed abilities in the last half of your book is a very different thing. That's where the reader's like, wait, now you're cheating on me. This feels like you're cheating. The thing about this is it's not as much an epic fantasy or speculative fiction problem as you think, because you could do this in, let's say you're writing a Regency romance. You can change the rules at the end. You can say, oh, they get together. Oh, he decided he's in love with her. You could do that just like we could say, oh, I decided that he can now suddenly fly. And you, as a writer, your job is not necessarily you've got to look at these plot archetypes and say, how can I do this in a satisfying way? You're looking to make it satisfying. And for me, the way I make it satisfying is I make sure that the pieces are foreshadowed so that when they're put together, the reader says, oh, I should have known they could do that all along. But that's not the only way to do it. For instance, if your story is a romance and your story is about the characters getting together, if one of them uses magic at the end in kind of an unsatisfying way to solve a problem, that's not a big deal as long as the problem isn't about the characters getting together. Watch, like I like to use the old Lois and Clark TV show, if anyone's seen this. It's a Superman show, right? I love this show. It was really cool, and because it was about Superman having to interact in the real world. And often, he'd use his powers to solve some big problem, like just the snap of the fingers. But the problem was never, how do I interact? How do I get along? How do I, what are the relationships? Those he couldn't use his powers to solve. So the powers were almost inconsequential. They were flavor. And if you're writing your story and your conflict, if you've looked and said, oh, this is about these interpersonal relationships, then you can use the magic in other ways, and it's not going to ruin your story in the same way as if you're writing a book, often like mine, where figuring out how the magic works is part of the coolness of how your ending works.
And I think that you could boil that whole thing down to, is it realistic inside your world? Does it work for what you're writing?
Yeah, definitely. For this person, if I may be so humble as to suggest you Google Sanderson's First Law and read that essay, you'll find some answers.
This actually leads in very well to another question from Google. This is from Scott Maddock, who asks, how much research into the science behind your magic systems do you do, and how do you determine the optimal balance between realistic systems and fun systems?
I play a little more fast and loose than Brandon does. I know that he's very strict on these things and try to approach it very scientifically. I kind of cheat here and there, but I try to approach it in a similar manner. And in terms of research, I don't do a ton. I'm very much a Wikipedia research guy. But in terms of the magic, for me, it was looking up the muzzle velocity of a musket, things like that. But not a lot more.
I would say honestly, Brian, I got a couple of oh come ons when I was reading Promise of Blood from you, because you aren't quite as strict as I like to be with the way that the magic works and things like this. I absolutely love the book, but you did get a few of those. I will admit it to you. For me, the way the science works, I like to err on the side of fun. That means, for me, I want to know what I'm doing and what laws of physics I'm breaking and how I'm breaking them. So I do a significant amount of research into this, and I rely upon my other assistant, Peter, who's got a great scientific mind. I rely upon my editor, Moshe, who was editor of the Science Fiction Book Club and really knows his stuff. Occasionally, we have to go to a real expert. The three of us can't come up with it, so we go grab a physicist and say, hey, can you explain this to us, or things like that. But at the end of the day, the idea is I want I have this sort of rule for myself, which I call err on the side of awesome, which basically means at the end of the day, find what's awesome and build your story around that, rather than letting your book become less awesome because of very external pressures. And so yeah, I would say that I have a tendency toward Brian-esque sort of things in that area, but I really like to know what laws I'm breaking and why. A good example of this is Way of Kings, right? I want to do the bridge cruise. So we spent a lot of time looking at bridge cruise. If you haven't read the books, these are big bridges that people carried across these big 20-foot chasms in the ground as kind of a siege tactic. Warfare system, and it's very fun, and a character gets forced into a bridge crew. It's this horrible, brutal thing. Well, we looked and said, okay, what would it take? How heavy would these bridges have to be for horses to cross them? And we got back the numbers, and we're like, oh boy, this is really hard to make work. And so we had to invent a magical type of wood. A wood that is stronger than what we have in our world and lighter. It basically is kind of a magical balsa wood, so that we could actually do these bridges across these chasms. We made all the numbers work, but we had to have a magical solution because otherwise we couldn't have done it. Now, if you were writing a very strictly scientific book, you would have said, well, we can't do bridge crews. I didn't say that. I said that we have to do bridge crews. Let's figure out how to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
You're muted.
No, I'm not muted. Sorry about that. We've talked about magic for a little while. Let's talk about characters for a few minutes. You both write books that have many point of view characters. You're alternating between them, keeping track of what different characters are up to. Let's talk for a little while about how do you keep track of where the characters are, who they're with, and also do you tend to have, and in your current books, do you have a character that you particularly like writing, that they're just a lot of fun to write from their perspective?
I generally don't pick favorite characters. It's just you need to be able to write every character as if they were your favorite while you're writing them. And so if I'm not feeling that this character is my favorite at the moment, I ask myself why, and I try to make them more awesome. As for how do I keep track of all the different characters, this has never really been an issue for me. One thing that I do in a longer book is I will write by viewpoint chunk. I'll do a big chunk from one character's viewpoint, then I'll do a big chunk from another character's viewpoint, then I'll go back and interweave them and make sure it's all working. This only works really well if their plot lines are separated, and hopefully, or not hopefully, but it works best if they're separated in place as well. And so if they're interacting with each other a lot, I can't do it by viewpoint. I have to then intersperse it. I have to write it as it's happening. But for most of my big books, like The Wheel of Time is a good example of this, I would write and say, I'm going to write Perrin now, and I would write Perrin for a couple of months and get done with Perrin's big scenes, and then jump to someone else. Say, I'm going to write Matt now.
No, I have a very similar approach to Brandon. I don't. I do have favorites at times. If there's a particularly really cool scene that I'm writing from one point of view character, then yeah, they're going to be my favorite. But generally, if I look at a character and I'm not enjoying that I'm writing them, then I know something's either wrong with their motivation at the time or with where they're going with the story, and I know I need to fix it. Because if I'm not enjoying writing them, then the reader's probably not going to enjoy reading it. I do have favorites in terms of side characters, characters that aren't the point of view. For my books, that would be Capol and Privileged Bourbador. Those are my two favorites to have on screen at any given time because of the characters themselves, what they're going to do and what they're going to say.
What's the bodyguard guy with the cigarette?
That's Oldham. He's another.
Oh, man, that guy was awesome. Anyway, I got a question for you, Brian. What's the deal with blood in the title of books lately? Have you noticed this? Like, blood is the new dragon, right? The last 3 years, half the books it seems have blood in the title. Where'd that come from?
No, I have no idea, but I noticed within a few months of my editor and I agreeing on the title, Promise of Blood, that books seem to have blood in them a bit. And then once mine came out, I was seeing them everywhere. and we agreed upon book 2, the Crimson Campaign, and suddenly I started seeing Crimson, and I don't know if it's just me or if it's just kind of waves of popular buzzwords.
You're just right ahead of the trend, Brian.
I haven't seen Crimson as much, but I'll have to keep an eye out for that. I wonder if it's the grimdark sort of thing where everyone's like, oh, grimdark. What's grimdark? Blood is gritty and dark. Let's use blood. And it's just kind of a psychological thing where a lot of people end up using it. It certainly fit your book very well, but I've seen other ones come out that I'm like, why are you using this word in the title? This makes no sense.
Yeah.
I had another character question for you. I'm just trying to find it in the scroll. There we go. This is from Rune on Google. How do you avoid creating characters that are archetypes?
Ooh.
Okay, you're not going to avoid being able to create characters that are archetypes. I will tell you that straight out. As soon as you finish your story and it's out there, people will decide which archetypes you are, and they will put you on TV tropes, and you cannot escape that. It is just completely impossible. The only way, I mean, everything these days is archetypal. And even if you're like, my character is going to be completely erratic and out of there and everything, that's an archetype too. The way that what your question really should be asking is, how do I make sure that my characters are well-rounded and feel like real people? Because that's what you want to have happen. They're going to be archetypal, and you can't escape that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to say there's no original characters, but there's probably not. Your characters are going to have something of some other character you've read or you've heard of before, I think that every character that's written is going to be a kind of a conglomerate. I mean, I like looking at characters and saying, I really like this about them, and then using it somehow. I do my very best not to copy, because that's not cool. But it's borrowing and piecing together, I think, is kind of how you create something that feels original while also being being recognizable to the reader.
Yeah, you want to ask yourself, you want to start defining your characters for yourself by who they are, not by their role in the story. Once you start saying this is the wise mentor, then you're gonna stray into cliche, and that character's not going to have any lifeblood. Once you instead start saying, okay, this character loves this and has passion for this. This character hates this. This character, acts like this. If we were out at lunch together, this is what the character would talk about. If you can define those sorts of things instead, and then make that person react to the plot rather than having the plot define who your character is, you're going to do a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an interesting question from Twitter. It'll be nice to hear a perspective from someone who's been writing for a bit longer and someone who's fairly new to being a published author. Can you talk about how you react to fan reactions, theories, and communities? Is it ever a distraction for you?
I'm just getting to the point where I've got a couple. I'll just see once in a while because I do that horrible thing that authors are not supposed to do, where I Google myself. I'll see something once in a while, and usually it just makes me chuckle. Sometimes they'll be right, sometimes they'll be wrong, and the fact that they're even thinking and talking about it is kind of cool to me.
Yeah, I used to do all that too. Right, like the first couple years, I was like keeping track of Google hits and saying what people were saying, and watching on LiveJournal was very big back then, saying what people were saying on LiveJournal and stuff like this, and I don't do much of it anymore, honestly. It's I do interact a lot with the fans, but working on the Wheel of Time taught me that I just have to follow my instincts. I have to write the best story I can, and reacting too much to fans is a bad place to be. Now, you do write for an audience. And I do want, what I will ask myself, what will my fans think is awesome? What's going to make this book great? What I won't ask myself is, well, this guy on this website said this one thing about this one character. How can I prove him wrong? And that in that way lies madness.
I'll sometimes see criticisms, and if I see a criticism over and over again,
Yeah.
it usually means that they have a point, and I
That's
try to look at them positively and say, well, this is a great learning experience. I wasn't aware of this about my writing, and I need to keep it in mind in the future.
Yeah, that is a good point to make. And my assistant Peter's pretty good at watching these things and saying, "Hey, Brandon, this is showing up a lot." Um, it's been very weird for me. For a while, like I hung out on all the science fiction fantasy forums, right? I was on Westeros, and I was on just all these various places, and I would pop in and chat with people and whatnot. And then suddenly I hit this sort of threshold where every one of these forums had a thread about me, and it became very distracting. I couldn't go to Steven Erickson's forums any longer because I would have a 3-page thread talking about me or my latest book or something I'd said, and that this was during the time when I just was hitting the advent, the Wheel of Time was coming out and things like this, and so I was very much in the public perception then, but it was very difficult to pay attention to my writing, and I just had to cut off all of that and say I just can't do any of it. I can't go to any of these places because I want to engage everyone in discussions, and I just have to let it lie.
Speaking of difficult things about writing, Debbie on Google asks, which part of the writing process do you struggle with more, and how do you deal with that?
Revision for me. I do not like revising. I still don't like revising. It took me years, longer than it maybe should have, to get published because I would never revise my manuscripts. I didn't want to. I still find it very. It's my least favorite part. How about that? I have to grit my teeth. Now it's essential. I had to learn how to do it, and I think that if you don't learn how to revise, you're not going to have a great book. You're going to have a good book. It's that taking a good book and making it great that often separates the amateur from the pro. But I don't have to like it.
Yeah, no, I'm not a fan of revision. At times it can buzz through and feel really fun because I've hit a section where obviously I was in my stride when I was writing it, and it's all very good. But then I'll hit a section where I'm just like, oh my goodness, this whole part is garbage. I've got to rewrite it, and that's the worst feeling because you feel like you already did that work.
Yeah, it's a kick to the gut when you realize I have to do this entire big change, and it's going to make the book fantastic, but it's going to be like writing a new book.
Let's go from the difficult part of writing to the fun part of writing. Jeremy on Google asks, what's your brainstorming process like? How do you come up with unique and new ideas for worlds and for magic?
Honestly, I do all my brainstorming with my wife. We like to go on long car trips or just plop down on the couch and throw ideas back and forth to each other about back when I was writing Promise of Blood, it was about what's the magic system going to be like, what's the world like, and now that I'm in the middle of 6 books in a single universe, I'm more like how is this problem going to be solved? This character's hit a little bit of a brick wall. How do I get out of it? Things like that.
For me, books come out of separate ideas combining together in interesting ways, oftentimes. And I very rarely sit down and say, okay, time to brainstorm something completely new. What's it going to be? Most of the time it's, okay, I've had these 4 ideas for the last 6 years that are starting to interact in a really cool way with a new idea I had last month. These are all combining into what's looking like a great story. How can I build this story out? How can I smooth over the rough parts? What holes in my world building or my storytelling exist? And that's when I sit down with a document and I build a book guide, as I call it, which is outlined, which is world building and things like this for a story. It's occasionally I'll need to fill a hole and I'll sit and brainstorm. I'll usually turn on music and go for a walk or go to the gym or whatever it is, something where I'm moving and try to just imagine and think and move along to the music. Sometimes I will grab Peter or Isaac or both or whatever, and we'll sit down and we'll brainstorm. That happens as well. It's a resource I have now that I have these assistants I can grab and force to do these things. And so, yeah, it's very individual to each book at the same time, because in some books you'll be like, wow, this setting is awesome, but I have no characters to go along with it. Sometimes you'll be writing a book, you'll be like, wow, this character, I have to put him somewhere. How am I going to fit this character into this setting? And it is really fun because it's new and different every time.
With Promise of Blood, for me, it developed over a series of ideas that kind of strung together similarly. And I went and saw Public Enemies, the Johnny Depp movie, and I came out of it thinking, holy crap, it'd be so cool to write a short story where guys are robbing banks with Tommy guns and magic. And I had that kind of sitting in the back of my head for a long time, trying to figure out how that would work. And then my wife and I watched Sharp's Rifles, the first episode of the I think it's BBC with Sean Bean, and about halfway through the episode, I said, "That's my next project. It's going to be an epic fantasy set in the 1800s." And so I took that idea with guns in the 1920s with magic, subtracted 120 years, and I had what I wanted to go for.
Yeah, I think it's really awesome that we're seeing a lot more of this flintlock fantasy. And I don't know who coined that term. You're the first one I heard use it, and I really like it. It's alliterative. It's fun. It's part of this sort of what I feel fantasy needs to be doing, which is explore different places that we can look at the fantastical and the epic fantasy, and instead of retreading a lot of the plots that have happened before, see what other places we can go with them. And I view Promise of Blood as being kind of at the forefront of this wave that's happening.
Yeah, me and Django Wexler, his 1,000 Names, it's really good. It came out just a few months after mine. And it was set in the same time period, and I had this nail-biting worry when I heard about it that, oh my gosh, we both got the same hook, and then I read it, and it's as different as two medieval epic fantasies.
Exactly.
And it made me so happy to see that it was and it wasn't just a gimmick, but a spreading kind of world.
I'm just glad that I managed to do guns and magic before it hit as the big thing, so that I didn't feel like I was riding the wave.
Oh, I think I had just finished the first draft of Promise of Blood when I saw the cover for the Mistborn book with the guy with the flintlock on it. And I wanted to strangle you.
I'm not flintlock though. I'm 1910. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I think I own it, but I haven't read it yet. So.
Yeah. I'm 1910. I'm electric lights. Advent and automobiles and things like that. So don't stress.
We've got a couple questions on Twitter that are sort of related, so I'm just going to throw them out to you at the same time. The first one is, do you have any thoughts on the style of prose that fantasy writers generally use? And then following up on that, was there a moment when you realized what style of writing worked best for you, or did you try to be someone else before you figured out who you were writing as?
I don't feel like prose is what I do. I don't pretend to be an awesome, smith of words or anything like that. I'm kind of here to tell stories, and hopefully, if it sounds good along the way, then that'll help, the readers. But in terms of I usually don't author. I usually don't notice when I'm reading, and it's flower language. I'm reading it for the plot. Mark Lawrence, I've heard people describe his writing as amazing, and I kind of didn't notice because I was loving the book that I was reading. And so, it kind of is to each his own for that, personally.
I would say that epic fantasy, one of the strengths of speculative fiction is that there isn't a style. Speculative fiction is just the genre that includes what couldn't be, or what might be, or what isn't. And once you put that in, then you're one of us, which is really cool. you can go and point at like a cozy mystery and say, this is the style of a cozy mystery, or a police procedural. And granted, there are going to be things that break that style, but you can say this is the style for this genre of story. That doesn't exist for science fiction fantasy, for epic fantasy. You can have Gene Wolfe in epic fantasy, and you can have Brandon Sanderson in epic fantasy. You can have Pat Rothfuss in epic fantasy. You can have Ursula Le Guin in epic fantasy. You can have Anne McCaffrey. And each of these people are going to be different places on this spectrum. For me, the best essays on writing that I've found often are the ones that relate to George Orwell's philosophy, where he would talk about how he wanted his prose to be a window pane through which the story happened, and anytime you saw the window pane instead, whether it's a spot on the window pane, which is, you know, a mistake where you've done something jarring, or a piece of stained glass window distracting you from the story, he wanted to avoid that. And I take that personal philosophy. I'm not trying to write a stained glass window, but there are authors who write a stained glass window and their prose is beautiful, and that is a big, that's a nice thing about their stories. I would say that Pat Rothfuss has beautiful stained glass window sections of his writing, and it's one of the reasons why I enjoy his writing. And so you can enjoy a lot of different things. I am shooting for, like Brian said, I want the window to be as clear and clean as possible to let you see the story that's beyond it.
Mm-hmm.
We're running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to ask a couple questions in a row that I think will be fairly short answers. The first one, this is an interesting one from Eric on Google. What's it like to listen to your own book on audiobook coming out of, from someone else's voice? Do you notice anything different about it listening to it versus having written it and reading it?
Yeah, you're like, oh wow, I should never have used those two words together. Makes me say, like Mary says, Mary Robinette Cole, who's a friend, reads all of her books out loud during the revision process. I really ought to do that, but mine are so big. I'm like, I will never get through this thing. I'll read the shorter ones sometimes to my wife. But yeah, you're like, I should never have put those two words together. It's also fun just like seeing artwork of your book. Right, when Michael Whalen does these covers for me, and I'm like, wow, that's a fantastic interpretation of what I've written. Some of it's exactly what I imagined, some of it's not, yet it's cool and spins me off in thinking different directions. The same thing happens when you hear Michael Kramer read one of my voices. It was really fun. He came to one of my signings once. He does a lot of my audiobooks, and he started reading, and the character voices came out, and I'm like, that is so surreal to see him, to hear the character. So it's like three parts, right? Somebody I wrote, somebody whose voice I know a lot, but now putting a face to it, and then suddenly the character coming out of him. It's really cool, but it's just a different interpretation.
I can't listen to my own audiobooks. I listen to the snippets when I get them, the first 10 minutes or whatever, and I just whatever the combination of things is. Maybe it's because I'm not really an audiobook listener in general, but I just can't handle it. It seems so weird to me.
Now, I have to say, comment on something you said earlier. When you asked us the question, you said, I'm going to try to ask some short ones. You're talking to two epic fantasy writers.
You're saying there's no short answer.
No, there are no short answers.
Well, the second one of those I know is not going to be a short answer, but so many people have asked that I'm going to go ahead and ask you anyway, which is if you have any advice for aspiring writers, especially aspiring fantasy writers.
Yes, I have a ton. Too much to put here. I would say, number one, Writing Excuses, my podcast. We need to have you on. We had you, Brian?
No, you haven't.
We need to have you on. My podcast, very popular, and you can listen through your browser. You don't have to do like the whole iTunes thing. Go look up things there. My writing lectures we have recorded, and they are available on YouTube, and this year's lecture series is going to be going up soon on my website. So there's that. The number one thing I would say to you as a writer is train yourself to be a writer. Don't look at yourself as a person who has written a book or who will write a book. You are a writer in training. Just like you may have a friend who wants to be a doctor, and they're going to spend 8 years becoming a doctor. If you're willing to say, I'm going to spend the next 8 years training myself to be a writer, you're going to look at this very differently from, I want to write a book someday. It's gonna encourage you to write every day, or at least work around your schedule. Some people aren't everyday writers, but you're gonna figure out your style. You're gonna figure out what makes you write, what makes you spend time writing, what makes you produce good fiction. You're gonna look at each book as learning experience, not as something perfect and magical that you write and then set on a pedestal. You're gonna do you're gonna just approach things differently if you're looking at becoming a writer.
My one big piece of advice is usually know your own flaws. Be self-aware about your writing, and don't get offended about people criticizing you. One of the biggest things I learned in Brandon's class was doing the writing groups, which I kind of hate writing groups, but it was fantastic for me to do because you have to sit there and you have to shut up and not respond when people tell you what's wrong with your books. And it helps you learn to take the criticism and really internalize it and figure out what's wrong with your writing and how to fix it. It's a great diagnosis tool that I think a lot of people don't take advantage of.
Yeah, and I will say writing groups are not for everyone. And in my class, I'm very upfront with the fact that you have to do one for this class period to experience what Brian just experienced. And if after the class period you find this is terrible for me, you can never use that tool again, and it's just fine. There are plenty of writers who don't do it. But it is a good idea to go through something like that and just get that experience.
All right, here's the last question, which again was asked by a lot of people. What are some books that you've read recently that you really loved or were really impressed by, both in fantasy and outside of the genre?
Let's see. I'm in the middle of Acacia, which I'm enjoying. I like that book. Before that, I would say probably the best one that I've read would be I really like His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novik. And those would be two. Otherwise, I've been reading a lot about Aztec culture, which I don't think you guys will find all that interesting.
The last book I finished was Wesley Chu's Lives of Tao, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's not epic fantasy. It's modern day science fiction, maybe, but it's very funny and very fun. Good book. He's actually up for the Campbell this year. And the one that I've actually got sitting right here waiting for me to read is Sworn in Steel by Doug Hulick. And it's the second in his series. The first book, which was very good, is I believe it's just Among Thieves, and that's a fantastic book. And his book comes out the same day mine does next week, so I'm looking forward to it.
All right, thanks very much to both of you. Thank you, everyone who's watching, for the great questions and just for watching. Again, I'm Ellen Wright at Orbit. Brandon Sanderson's most recent book, Words of Radiance, is out now, and Brian McClellan's The Crimson Campaign out next week. And hopefully we'll be able to have more of these events, so keep tuned.